In a quiet little town where everyone seemed to know each other's business, there lived a girl who often went unnoticed. She wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't wear expensive clothes or carry the latest gadgets. Her family struggled to make ends meet. But despite their hardships, she had something special, a love for music that lit up her world. Every evening, after finishing her chores, she would sit by an old, slightly out-of-tune piano in the corner of their tiny living room and lose herself in melodies. It was her escape, her safe space, and her way of speaking when words failed her. At school, things weren't as kind to her. People judged her based on what they saw, her worn-out bag, her simple clothes, and her shy demeanor. They assumed she didn't have much to offer. Among those who dismissed her was the music teacher, a strict man with a reputation for favoring students from wealthy families. He never missed a chance to remind everyone which students he believed had real potential. And unfortunately, this girl wasn't one of them. One day, during a class discussion about the upcoming auditions for the annual recital, the teacher turned his attention to her. With a smirk, he asked if she even planned to audition. The entire class fell silent, all eyes shifting toward her. She felt her cheeks burn as she nodded hesitantly. That's when he struck. Holding up her tattered sheet music, he made a mocking comment about how outdated it looked. "Let's see if someone like you can actually play something worth listening to," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. His words stung, not just because they were cruel, but because they echoed the doubts she'd heard her whole life. But deep inside, something stirred. Instead of shrinking away, she decided then and there that she wouldn't let his words define her. If anything, they fueled her determination. That night, sitting at her battered piano, she poured her heart into practicing a piece she'd been secretly working on for months. It wasn't some famous composition. It was hers. A melody born out of sleepless nights, whispered hopes, and tears shed in silence. Each note carried a piece of her soul, a reflection of everything she'd endured and dreamed of. As days passed, whispers filled the hallways about the auditions. Most students came from well-off families, dressed sharply and armed with brand-new instruments. But she stood quietly at the back of the line, clutching her worn folder of sheet music. When her name was finally called, she walked toward the stage, feeling the weight of judgmental stares. The teacher sat smugly at the judges' table, clearly expecting her to stumble. Little did he know, she was about to turn the tables in the most unexpected way. The day of the auditions arrived, and the atmosphere in the school auditorium was electric. Students from wealthy families filled the room, their polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor as they moved around confidently. They carried expensive instruments, gleaming violins, glossy guitars, and sleek keyboards, all symbols of privilege that seemed to scream, "Look at me!" The air buzzed with excitement, but also with competition. Everyone wanted a spot in the prestigious annual recital, and no one wanted to be left out. Amidst all this, she stood quietly at the back of the line, trying to blend into the shadows. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her folder of sheet music, its edges frayed from years of use. She could feel the eyes of her classmates darting toward her, some curious, others mocking. Whispers floated through the air. "What's she doing here? Does she really think she can compete with us?" Each word hit like a tiny needle prick, but she kept her head down, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing. When her turn finally came, she walked slowly to the stage, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The bright lights blinded her momentarily, and for a second, she felt like running back to the safety of the wings. But then she remembered why she was there. Not for them, not for the teacher who had mocked her, but for herself. This was her chance to prove that she wasn't just the poor girl in the corner. She was someone with dreams, talent, and a voice worth hearing. As she sat down at the grand piano, a beautiful, shiny instrument that looked nothing like the old one she practiced on at home, she took a deep breath. For a moment, she let her fingers hover above the keys, feeling the cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. Then, closing her eyes, She began to play. The first notes rang out, soft and hesitant, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. But as she continued, something magical happened. The music swelled, filling the auditorium with a melody so raw and powerful that it silenced every whisper, every skeptical glance. It was as if the piano itself had come alive under her touch, telling a story only she knew how to tell. The piece was hers, an original composition born from sleepless nights, quiet tears, and unspoken hopes. Every note carried a fragment of her life, the struggles her family faced, the loneliness she felt at school, and the fire within her that refused to go out. The audience froze, captivated by what they were hearing. Even the students who had sneered at her earlier found themselves leaning forward, unable to look away. And then there was the teacher, the man who had mocked her outdated sheet music and doubted her abilities. At first, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing the same smug expression he'd had when he called her out in class. But as the music unfolded, his posture changed. His brows furrowed, his lips parted slightly, and eventually he sat upright, his eyes glued to her hands dancing across the keys. By the time the final chord echoed through the hall, the silence was deafening. For a brief moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, almost as if waking from a trance, the crowd erupted into applause. People clapped, cheered, and even whistled, their initial skepticism replaced by genuine admiration. She sat there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let anyone see her cry, even if they were tears of joy. As she stood up to leave the stage, she caught the teacher's gaze. There was no smirk this time, no sarcastic remark, waiting to cut her down. Instead, there was something else. Something unreadable. Maybe even a flicker of regret. But she didn't dwell on it. All that mattered now was the fact that she had played her heart out, and the world had listened. The applause was still ringing in her ears as she stepped off the stage, her heart racing like it might burst out of her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Not just noticed, but truly seen. It was a strange feeling, one that brought both relief and unease. She had poured her soul into that performance, bearing parts of herself she hadn't even admitted to in private. And while the audience's reaction had been overwhelming, she couldn't shake the nagging thought. What happens now? Backstage, whispers began to swirl almost immediately. Some students were genuinely impressed, clapping her on the shoulder or offering hesitant smiles. But others weren't so kind. A group of girls huddled together near the corner, their voices low but sharp enough to cut. "There's no way she wrote that herself," one muttered. "It sounded too professional." Another chimed in. "Yeah, probably copied it from somewhere. Someone like her wouldn't have access to lessons or anything." Their words stung, not because they were unexpected, but because they hit close to home. She knew what people thought of her, what they always thought of her. Poor, unpolished, out of place. But hearing those doubts aired so openly made her stomach churn. Still, she didn't say anything. Instead, she focused on keeping her head high and reminding herself why she was here. To play, not to argue. The teacher who had mocked her earlier, he wasn't done either. When the judges convened to discuss the results, he raised his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Her piece, original, please. Let's not get carried away here. We need proof before we let someone like her represent the school." His tone dripped with condescension, as if her very presence on the stage was an insult to the institution. For a moment, anger flared inside her. How dare he question her work after everything she'd put into it? But then she took a deep breath and reminded herself of something important. Actions speak louder than words, so instead of lashing out, she decided to fight back in the best way she knew how, with evidence. That evening, she gathered every scrap of paper related to her composition, the rough drafts scribbled late at night, the recordings of her early practice sessions, even notes jotted down during moments of inspiration. She presented them to the school board the next day, laying out her creative process step by step. Each page told a story of hard work, determination, and countless hours spent perfecting her craft. By the time she finished, there was no room for doubt. This was hers, through and through. But the backlash didn't stop there. As news of her incredible performance spread, jealousy brewed among her classmates. Some accused her of getting lucky, while others claimed she must have had help from professionals. The teacher doubled down on his skepticism, publicly questioning whether someone from her background could really create something so extraordinary. Yet amidst all the noise, one person stood up for her, a renowned musician visiting the town for a workshop. This woman, known for her talent and fairness, asked to meet the girl everyone was talking about. After listening to her play again, she turned to the crowd and said simply, "This is genius, pure and raw. Talent like this doesn't come from privilege, it comes from the heart." Those words silenced the critics, at least for a moment, and gave her the validation she needed to keep going. Though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, she realized something crucial. People could doubt her all they wanted, but no one could take away the truth of what she'd created. Her music wasn't just notes on a page, it was her story, her voice, her triumph, and nothing, not cruel words, not unfair judgments, could ever change that. The controversy surrounding her performance grew louder with each passing day. People couldn't stop talking about her, some out of admiration, others out of disbelief. The girl who had once been invisible was now at the center of everyone's attention, and not all of it was kind. Whispers followed her in the hallways, and snide remarks reached her ears, no matter how hard she tried to ignore them. "She probably got outside help," one student muttered under their breath. Another rolled their eyes and said, "There's no way someone like her could come up with that on her own." Even the teacher who had mocked her during auditions refused to back down. He stood firmly by his accusations, insisting that her piece needed verification before she could qualify for the recital. His words carried weight because of his position, and soon, even some of the judges began to waver. They called her into a meeting, asking her to prove beyond any doubt that the composition was hers. For a moment, she felt the walls closing in. How could she convince people who seemed determined not to believe in her? But instead of crumbling under the pressure, she dug deep. That evening, she went home and gathered every scrap of evidence she could find. Crumpled sheets of paper filled with half-erased notes, recordings from late-night practice sessions where she stumbled over chords before finally nailing them, and even old voice memos where she hummed melodies to herself as ideas struck. Each piece told a story of struggle, patience, and relentless effort. She remembered long nights when the rest of the house was asleep, and she sat alone by the dim light of a table lamp, trying to make sense of the music swirling in her head. When she presented these materials to the school board the next morning, there was a shift in the room. The skeptical looks softened as they flipped through her handwritten drafts and listened to the progression of her recordings. One judge leaned forward, visibly moved, and asked, "Is this really how you came up with it?" She nodded quietly, explaining how every note was born from moments of pain, hope, and determination. By the end of her presentation, there was no denying it. The piece was hers, crafted entirely from her own heart and mind. Still, the backlash didn't disappear overnight. Some students continued to whisper behind her back, unwilling to accept that someone so ordinary could achieve something extraordinary. Others dismissed her success as a fluke, refusing to acknowledge her talent. But amidst the negativity, something unexpected happened. A renowned musician visiting the town heard about the buzz surrounding her performance and decided to step in. This woman, known for her sharp ear and fair judgment, requested a private meeting. When the girl nervously played her piece again, the musician closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. When the final note faded, she opened her eyes and looked directly at the girl. "This is pure artistry," she said firmly. Turning to the small audience gathered in the room, she added, Talent like this doesn't depend on wealth or privilege. It comes from authenticity, from living your truth. And that's exactly what I hear here. Her endorsement silenced many critics, including the teacher who had doubted her. Though he tried to brush off the musician's praise as irrelevant, his arguments lost their sting. Other teachers began to side with her, praising her dedication and creativity. Even some of her classmates started to see her differently, not as the poor girl in the corner, but as someone brave enough to stand up for herself and share her gift with the world. Through it all, she stayed grounded. She didn't gloat or retaliate against those who had doubted her. Instead, she focused on what mattered most, her love for music and the joy it brought her. The ordeal taught her an important lesson, that proving yourself isn't always about silencing critics. Sometimes it's about staying true to who you are, no matter what anyone says. And while she knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, she also knew she had the strength to face them, one note at a time. The night of the annual recital finally arrived, and the school auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Rows of chairs were filled to capacity, with parents, teachers, and students craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the stage. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers placed decoratively around the hall, and the soft hum of conversation created an almost electric energy. Everyone was eager to see who would shine brightest that evening, and for many, all eyes were on her. Backstage, she stood quietly in a borrowed gown, its fabric smooth against her skin. It wasn't extravagant or expensive, but it fit perfectly, making her feel just enough like herself to calm the fluttering nerves inside her chest. Around her, other performers paced nervously, adjusting their instruments or rehearsing final notes under their breath. But she didn't move much. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the sounds of preparation wash over her. The tuning of violins, the gentle strumming of guitars, the distant echo of someone practicing scales. These familiar noises grounded her, reminding her why she was here, not for applause, not for recognition, but because music was her heartbeat. When her name was announced, the room fell silent. She walked onto the stage slowly, her footsteps steady, despite the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her every move. As she approached the grand piano, she took a moment to glance at the audience. Some faces were curious, others skeptical, and a few even hostile. But scattered throughout the crowd, she noticed smiles, small, encouraging nods from people who believed in her. Those tiny gestures gave her strength as she sat down and placed her hands on the keys. For a brief second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then she began to play. The melody unfolded softly at first, hesitant yet full of promise, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a stormy sky. But soon it grew stronger, richer, filling the auditorium with a sound so raw and powerful that it felt alive. Every note carried emotion, pain transformed into beauty, struggle turned into triumph. The audience was spellbound. Even those who had doubted her couldn't look away. They were caught in the story her music told, a story of resilience, hope, and courage. As the final chord resonated through the hall, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted into applause. People clapped wildly, some rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Tears streamed down more than a few faces, including hers, though she tried to blink them back. For the first time in her life, she felt truly understood, not judged by where she came from or what she owned, but celebrated for who she was. Afterward, backstage, she was greeted by the visiting musician who had earlier defended her talent. The woman smiled warmly and pulled her aside. "You have something rare," she said earnestly, "a gift that deserves to be shared with the world." Then came the offer she hadn't dared to dream of, an invitation to study at a prestigious conservatory, fully funded. Her heart raced as she processed the words. This was more than just validation. It was a chance to step into a future she'd only imagined in her wildest dreams. Accepting the scholarship meant leaving behind everything familiar. The small town, her family's cozy home, the old piano in the corner. But she knew deep down that this opportunity could change her life forever. With tears in her eyes, she hugged her parents tightly that night, promising to make them proud. And as she drifted off to sleep, still hearing the echoes of her performance in her mind, she realized something profound. No matter how far she traveled or how much success she achieved, she would always carry her roots with her. Her music wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever struggled, hoped, and kept going. And now she had the chance to share it with the world. Years passed, and the shy girl who once played on an old, out-of-tune piano became a name people recognized. Her journey wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, sleepless nights spent perfecting her craft, and times when the weight of expectations felt overwhelming. But through it all, she held on to one thing: the love for her music. It was that same love that had carried her through the toughest days of her childhood, and now it propelled her toward heights she'd never imagined. Her performances began, drawing larger crowds, not just because of her technical skill, but because of the way she connected with her audience. When she sat at the piano, it wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about telling stories. Each piece she composed or performed carried fragments of her life, her struggles, and her dreams. People didn't just listen to her music, they felt it. After concerts, strangers would approach her, tears in their eyes, sharing how her melodies reminded them of their own battles and victories. In those moments, she realized her purpose wasn't just to create beautiful sounds. It was to remind others that they weren't alone. Despite her growing fame, she stayed grounded. She often returned to her hometown, visiting the small school where her journey had taken its first big turn. There, she met young students eager to learn but unsure if they belonged in the world of music. To them, she was proof that talent didn't come from privilege. It came from passion and hard work. She spent hours mentoring these kids, encouraging them to believe in themselves, even when others doubted them. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can or cannot do," she'd say. "Your voice matters, no matter where you come from." Back at the school, things had changed too. The teacher who had mocked her during the auditions eventually retired, his reputation tarnished by the memory of how he'd treated her. Some whispered that he regretted his actions, while others thought he simply faded into obscurity. Either way, his shadow no longer loomed over the music department. Instead, new teachers brought fresh perspectives, fostering creativity and inclusivity among students. The annual recital became less about competition and more about celebrating individuality, a shift inspired, in part, by her story. As for her original composition, the one she'd poured her heart into, it gained a life of its own. It was performed by orchestras around the world, recorded by artists who admired its depth, and even used in films to evoke raw emotion. Yet whenever she played it herself, whether in grand concert halls or intimate gatherings, it always carried the same authenticity. It was her anthem, a reminder of where she started and how far she'd come. In interviews, reporters often asked her about the teacher who had tried to humiliate her. Did she harbor resentment? Was there bitterness lingering beneath her success? But she shook her head every time, her expression calm and thoughtful. "He taught me something valuable," she said once, leaning forward slightly as if letting the audience in on a secret. "His words pushed me to prove myself. Not to him, but to me. Without that challenge, I might not have found the courage to step onto that stage." Her candor won people over. They admired not just her talent, but her grace. Here was someone who had faced adversity head-on and emerged stronger without losing sight of kindness. She didn't seek revenge or dwell on past hurts. Instead, she chose to focus on creating a better future for herself and for others. One day, years later, she received a letter from a former classmate. The note was short but heartfelt. "I'm sorry for doubting you back then. Watching everything you've achieved has made me realize how wrong we all were. You inspire me to be braver. Reading those words brought tears to her eyes, not because of sadness, but because of hope. If her story could change even one person's perspective, then every struggle had been worth it. And so, her journey continued, not just as a musician, but as a beacon of resilience and compassion. She proved that greatness isn't measured by wealth or status, but by the ability to rise above challenges and touch lives. For her, music wasn't just a career, it was a way to heal, connect, and inspire. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy far greater than any award or accolade, the belief that everyone has the power to transform their pain into purpose. Years rolled by, and the girl who once stood in the shadows became a symbol of hope for countless people. Her journey wasn't just about personal success, it was about breaking barriers and showing others that no dream is too big, no matter where you start. She traveled to cities she'd only seen in books, performed on stages that seemed larger than life, and met individuals whose lives were forever changed by her music. But despite all the fame and recognition, she never forgot the lessons she learned back in her small town. The importance of staying true to yourself, even when the world tries to push you down. One day, during a visit to her hometown, she decided to stop by her old school. The building looked almost the same, though some parts had been renovated over the years. Stepping inside felt surreal. Memories flooded back, from the quiet hallways where she used to walk unnoticed to the auditorium where her life had taken a dramatic turn. This time, however, she wasn't there as a student. She was invited to deliver a speech at an assembly, sharing her story with a new generation of kids who sat wide-eyed in front of her. Standing on the stage, she looked out at the sea of young faces staring up at her. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few seemed disinterested, just like she had been at their age. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," she began, her voice soft but steady. "To think your voice doesn't matter because of where you come from or what you have." The room grew quieter as she spoke, her words hitting home for many. "But let me tell you something. Your circumstances don't define you. What defines you is how you respond to them." She went on to share bits of her story, the struggles, the humiliation, the nights spent practicing until her fingers ached, but she didn't dwell on the pain. Instead, she focused on the strength she found within herself and the joy that came from pursuing something she loved. By the end of her talk, the students erupted into applause, some even rushing up to thank her personally. One boy shyly handed her a crumpled piece of paper with a rough sketch of a guitar. "I want to play someday," he whispered. She smiled, encouraging him to keep going, reminding him that every masterpiece starts with a single note. As she left the school that afternoon, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she'd come. The teacher who had mocked her was long gone. His legacy faded into obscurity. In his place were educators who believed in nurturing talent, regardless of background. Even the annual recital had evolved. It was now a celebration of individuality, rather than perfection, a tribute to creativity and courage. Her own career continued to flourish. She released albums that topped charts, collaborated with renowned artists, and performed in venues that once felt like distant dreams. Yet, amidst all the accolades, she remained humble. Success hadn't changed her. If anything, it deepened her gratitude for the people who had supported her along the way. Her family, her mentors, and even the critics who unintentionally pushed her to prove herself. In interviews, she often talked about resilience, not as some grand act of defiance, but as a quiet determination to keep moving forward. "Life will throw challenges at you," she said during one conversation. "Some will try to bring you down, and others will doubt your abilities. But the truth is, none of that matters unless you let it. What matters is what you choose to do next." Her words resonated with audiences worldwide, inspiring not just aspiring musicians, but anyone facing adversity. Eventually, she wrote a book, a collection of reflections, stories, and advice drawn from her experiences. It became a bestseller, read by people from all walks of life. Through its pages, readers found comfort, motivation, and a reminder that greatness isn't reserved for the privileged few. It's available to anyone willing to work for it, to believe in themselves, and to rise above their circumstances. Looking back on her journey, she realized that her greatest achievement wasn't the awards or the standing ovations. It was the impact she had on others. The young musician finding courage to pick up an instrument. The struggling artist reminded that their voice matters. The person battling self-doubt learning to take one more step forward. Her story proved that sometimes our darkest moments become the foundation for our brightest futures. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy far greater than any title or trophy. The belief that everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has the power to create something extraordinary.